everyone, and thank you for joining us for another episode of our Ask Me Anything series hosted by Side. I'm Leonie Dutton, and I'm delighted to be here. Joining us today, we have one of the country's leading voices on real estate, mortgage, and foreclosure trends. Rick Sharga is here with us. And to host, we have our very own Brett Jennings, who is the owner and founder of Real Estate Experts and a Side network partner in the Silicon Valley market. Thank you both for taking the time to share your insights with our community today.
Well, welcome, and thank you, Leanne, for that great introduction. So Rick and I are here today to talk a little bit about, obviously what's going on, not just with coronavirus, but how it's impacting the real estate market. And I think, one of the things, obviously, it's created a lot of fear and anxiety about our health risks and the economic risks. But one of the things I think the message we can come away with today is, although the world may be in crisis, your business doesn't have to be. So I know, Rick, you've got a lot of information on how specifically, like this particular, we may be facing a recession, and how this is probably not like the other recessions that we've experienced in the past. So if you want to go ahead and take off and share with us a little bit about, what impact this will have in regard of a recession, and what your thoughts are from there.
Yeah, I think. First of all, thank you to everybody at Side for having me participate today in the webinar. I always enjoy these interactions with the Side team, and look forward to more ahead. Hopefully, when we're talking about something that doesn't have everybody in a state of panic and locked into their homes. But for today, we'll make the best of it. And happy to be here with Brett. I think this little slide right here says everything that we really need to remember. Recession doesn't necessarily equal a housing crisis. And Brett, I think you have another slide right after this that's important to view in this context. In virtually every recession we've seen since World War II, it's actually been housing that's helped the economy get back out of the recession. The one notable exception was the recession that hit in 2008, the Great Recession. And the reason for that is that housing actually drove us into the recession last time. So the recession itself and the recovery from the recession, I think I lost something here. That's why I stopped.
We can hear you.
There we go. I'm back.
We can hear you.
Sorry about that. The recession itself and how we recovered from the recession really behaved very differently the last time than we'd seen in previous recessions. So again, what we've seen in prior recessions is home prices have actually increased over the course of the recession, and housing, particularly new home sales, helped drive us out. If you want to advance a little bit further, Brett.
Sure.
So I think there's three reasons to be hopeful about housing coming through this pandemic. And I recently completed a research report that I'm going to send up to the Side folks who are free to distribute as they'd see fit on prior pandemics and how the housing market has fared in those cases. And the fact of the matter is that housing has fared better than the overall economy, certainly fared better than the stock market during prior pandemics and recessions. And the research I looked at went back to the SARS pandemic and the swine flu pandemic and 9/11. And that's all right, you can jump ahead. The 9/11 terrorist attacks were probably the closest proxy we have for what's going on with the coronavirus, because in that case, we actually saw the economy shut down almost entirely for some period of time. And what we actually saw after 9/11, and I apologize for the chart being a little bit hard to read, but if you look at the bars in the middle of each of those months, we saw that we had the normal seasonal slowdown between August and September. And actually the drop-off that September, which is when the attacks took place, was a little more severe than in the year prior and the year after. Mm-hmm. But by October, the market had actually recovered. It picked up steam and really didn't slow down for the next year. So despite the stoppage in the economy and the recession that we were in 2001 to begin with, we saw home sales go up. And in the next slide, you'll see that home prices actually also increased. It's really starting with the November after 9/11. So there was a little bit of a dip in prices, but prices recovered very rapidly and throughout the following year. So we do have some history that suggests that home sales and home prices aren't necessarily as affected by what goes on during these pandemics or fiscal emergencies as other types of things like the overall economy and like the stock market are. And that gives me hope coming out of this pandemic as well. And the other thing that we wanted to talk about is the fact that going into this recession, the housing market was much better positioned than it was the last time. So if you remember last time, we had a whole series of events that led us into the housing crash. And that recession is the second vertical gray bars that you see in this chart, which we have courtesy of First American Economics. And they track something they call the Real Home Price Index. And what that shows is a consumer's house buying power. And it factors in three things. It factors in home prices, it factors in interest rates, and it factors in wages. And if you look at what we're seeing here in this chart, what it really represents is that in the last time we went through this, home buying power was actually fairly weak, and home prices were actually higher on a per capita basis than they are today. Going into this pandemic, we actually saw home prices being more affordable because of low interest rates and because of wage growth that for the last few quarters has actually outpaced home price appreciation. So here's why I believe we're in better shape coming into this than we were into the last recession. In 2008, the market was egregiously overbuilt. The builders had continued to build really sort of past the point where home sales were increasing. The market is significantly underbuilt today by as many as 300 to 400,000 units a year. And I don't have to tell anybody who's been trying to find listings in California how difficult it's been and how scarce inventory has been for sale over the last couple of years. In 2008, home prices were overvalued and really papered over by lax lending standards. But they're reasonably valued today. They're not cheap, and there are certain markets like the Bay Area, like Silicon Valley, like other places in the country like Austin, Texas, that are a bit frothy, but not overvalued the way they were 10 years ago. Coming into this pandemic, homeowners had a record level of equity, which is a big shift from where we were in the Great Recession. And really importantly, go ahead.
Just to chime in there, Rick, as you and I were preparing for this meeting just over the past couple of days, I was surprised when I checked the local statistics here in Santa Clara County. Specifically, I looked at the San Jose Metro. There's 178,000 single-family homes, and 78% of homeowners in our area have 50% or have at least 50% equity. So that was just to give a real statistic of what it's like on the ground here. I was surprised to see that, what you just mentioned on that point there.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Brett. And a lot of people also have to keep you also have to keep in mind that a lot of people own their homes outright. And I know you had some statistics on that.
Yeah, it was smaller here because I do think people are carrying a mortgage because our median home price is $1,250,000 here in the South Bay. It might even be higher in San Francisco, $1,400,000 or such. I think some of those people carry a mortgage just for the tax benefits of the write-off, because it was about 11% of homeowners had no mortgage whatsoever, and 78% have 50%, at least 50% equity.
And nationally, it's even more than that. So if you look at things from a national perspective, there's about 120 million housing units, and there's about 50 million active mortgages. So more than half of homeowners are actually homeowners. The other 50 million are still working on that. But again, equity levels are very high. And that's important because when you do get into a downturn, having equity can be the difference between a massive wave of foreclosures like we saw last time, or people having opportunities to get out and avoid a foreclosure before things get too bad. Loans are also of a much higher quality. And this is something for you to think about as we go through this pandemic. It's been difficult to get a loan since the Great Recession. Average FICO scores have been very high. There have been requirements for a loan-to-value ratio cap, debt-to-income ratio caps, all of that sort of thing. I think as we go through this pandemic and until the mortgage markets settle down a little bit, we're going to talk about that a little later, it's going to start to get harder again for people to get loans. And in some cases, lenders are just pricing loans out of the market. There was an article yesterday that I believe it was Wells Fargo was offering jumbo loans, which are an important consideration for a state like California, but they were offering them at a 10% interest rate, which is roughly 2.5 times what you're paying for anything in the conventional market. So lenders are pricing themselves out because of the risk they see in the market today.
Okay, but so that's interesting, Rick, because I've heard that kind of struck a chord of a little bit of fear in me, honestly, when I had one of my buyers agents in my group say, hey, my client who's shopping for a jumbo mortgage who was previously pre-approved, they just quoted him, I think it was like 3.5 points and a crazy high interest rate. Yet at the same time, we have one of our lenders who works with one of the big banks, PNC Mortgage, that was still able to underwrite jumbo mortgages at a relatively normal interest rate and fee. Why the disparity there?
Sometimes it comes down to warehouse lines. Now, it wouldn't be the case in Wells Fargo's case because they're funding their own loans. It really is certain lenders voting themselves off the island temporarily. There's a great uncertainty in the market right now. Part of it's driven by the Federal Reserve coming in and buying mortgage-backed securities. That changes the pricing on what is available for a lender in terms of what they pay for their capital on an almost daily basis. There's some uncertainty about what interest rates are going to look like, a few months from now, and in some cases a few hours from now. There's also some issues regarding servicing rights. And so anything that looks even a little bit risky, a lot of lenders are basically shunning right now. JP Morgan Chase announced, I believe, day before yesterday, that for the time being on a conventional loan, just your vanilla conventional loan, there's now a minimum FICO score of 700 and a minimum down payment of 20%. So that doesn't mean you can't get a loan, but only the most perfectly qualified borrowers are going to be able to get the types of loans that we're getting a little easier. And I suspect we're going to see this really until the pandemic winds down a bit and we see what the underlying economy does. Having said that, Brett, you make a great point. This is the time to roll out your Rolodex, or that dates me, whatever the virtual equivalent of a Rolodex is, your email database, and be in touch with all of your mortgage providers because there are lenders out there who are still fighting for business. They're a little bit hungrier for business. Mm-hmm. And you can help your clients find the type of loan they need. It's just going to probably take a little bit more work than it did a few weeks ago.
Got it.
And then the biggest variables for all of this, how long is a lockdown going to last? How many businesses are going to survive? And how many jobs will there be for the people who've been laid off or furloughed to go back to? So the bigger companies have been claiming that they're ready to welcome back most, if not all, their employees. I don't live too far from Disneyland here in Orange County. They're paying their employees through April 18th, furloughing them, but are basically telling them all as soon as this winds down, they're welcome to come back. Some of the airlines who have laid off thousands and thousands of people are wondering how long it's going to take them to get back up to the kind of volume they were doing. And are starting to offer early retirement programs for some of their employees. So there are a lot of variables, but I think the biggest one, honestly, is going to be how long the lockdown lasts, because the longer it lasts, the harder it's going to be for a lot of small businesses in particular to stay in business.
Now, one question we've been getting, Rick, from some of our clients, and I know having lived through the 2008 recession, was that you're pointing to that fact right now that credit will tighten and contract. If someone has a lot of equity in their house and maybe they don't have as much wage security or job security, would it be a smart move for them to potentially open up that HELOC or tap that HELOC in this climate now, earlier in the cycle, just as a little bit of a defensive move?
The old saying is cash is king. Mm-hmm. And particularly if you're currently employed but are concerned that employment or that income might be a little bit unstable going into this pandemic further, a HELOC isn't a bad idea. The key is if you tap into it, don't run out and spend it right away. Use it as a cash reserve. Tell people the same thing about their credit cards. And we started to see credit card usage tick up a little bit over the last couple of weeks. And the hope is that people don't get themselves way over their head in debt by living off their credit cards while they're either not making as much money or out of work. But yeah, HELOC in today's market, if you can get a good value, not a bad way to use that equity to get you through a tough time if you need to.
Got it.
And by the way, there are safeguards in place on those home equity lines that didn't exist 10 years ago. So, generally speaking, a lender won't issue you one of those that takes you past about 80%, that 80% loan to value ratio. So they're going to require you to still have about 20% equity before they issue a home equity line. So hopefully it'll be one of the ways that people don't get themselves into as much trouble as we saw last time around.
Got it. Well, that's really helpful. So that's a little bit of a lay of the land kind of where we are there. We want to kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about the prognosis for the recovery. Specifically answer, the three questions really that are probably on all of us as real estate professionals' mind. How deep will this thing go as far as the recession and its impact? How long may it last? And how long will it take to recover? And, I did some quick checking here in our market in Santa Clara County, so we're in Silicon Valley. I know we have people from all over, mostly all over California, probably some other people from across the country, but so these numbers are specific to the San Francisco Bay Area. And I was looking at month over month, right? What we were obviously on an increase in price because we had low inventory, really low interest rates, but we were also on an increase of listings, just the seasonality of our market, right? February, March, April, rise that we have. And certainly what we're seeing is not only did shelter in place flatten the curve for the spread of the coronavirus, it flattened the curve of our climbing market. So specifically, we're seeing the number of new listings dropped. This is month over month, 59% here in Santa Clara County for single family residential. And the number, interestingly, I was surprised that we had this level of parity, that 59% of the number of pendings had dropped. So it looks like a little more than half of the players, so to speak, both buyers and sellers, have left the playing field. We are seeing it's hard to track right now the sales prices trending down. We did see a little dip in the median price point, which I might ask you for your insight on that, Rick, in a minute. But we are seeing prices starting to trend down. We're obviously not getting as many homes selling. And I don't know, Leanne, if you can do a poll for the viewers online to ask if you've had a listing that has gone on the market after shelter in place. If you did receive offers, are they less than what your initial expectation was? So again, if you've put a listing on the market after you've gone on shelter in place, have you received offers lower than your initial expectation? I think we're going to see that a bit. We do see the supply and demand, at least in our market, decreasing commensurately. But the fact that we don't have access to these properties is creating a slack in demand, I think, that's causing the prices. And then we got some buyers that are just like, not predatory, but opportunistic, right? That think like, oh, hey, okay, well, it must be a really motivated seller, so let's just try to lowball. We've seen some of those come in. So be curious to see, and Leanne, glad to have you chime in with some of those numbers or stats as we go. But, we had a talk with Leslie Appleton Young that Side hosted a while back, and I think she was saying, we should be prepared to see a slowdown. Go ahead.
Go back. That's an important slide. One of the questions I have for you, Brett, is if Leslie gave you any indication of the percentage of listing prices that had been reduced. Did she talk about that?
She didn't. She didn't. And it was I think this was 2 weeks ago. So we were literally 10 days into shelter in place. Just commenting on a couple of these really quickly. First of all, we should be prepared to see numbers we've never seen before. So nobody should get overly panicked by what they're about to see. Or offended.
Yes. I mean, if you look at the chart of historical unemployment filings, and you look at it historically now, it sort of looks like a flat line for about 100 years and then goes straight up like a rocket. We've never had this many people file for unemployment this quickly. In fact, the first time unemployment filings 2 weeks ago at 6 million were 10 times the prior high. So this is an unprecedented situation. We're going to see unprecedented numbers. The reason I say not to panic is because hopefully most of these numbers will be temporary, and we should see most of them mitigated relatively quickly, and relative is a key word there, over time. One of the things I would suggest could be happening when we take a look at prices, not listings, but actual sales prices, is I think we're probably seeing that happen because of two primary reasons. One is the product mix. Everybody I've talked to has suggested, at least anecdotally, that we're seeing more activity in the low to mid-priced range of homes sold than we are at the upper mid to high end of homes being sold. All by itself,
I would say that's consistent with what we're seeing here in the South Bay. And we have listings at the $4 million price point. We're getting like hardly any showings, and around that median price point, those people who, the largest segment of the bell curve, there is a subset of those people that still have to transact right now. For example, we had one, the winning bidder on a property we just recently listed. I know the husband was a police officer and she was a nurse, and she was 7 months pregnant. So things were imminent, but they were going to have to make a move regardless. So
and that's the other factor. So I think you have product mix. Lower priced homes are continuing to sell, whereas the higher priced ones are kind of either off or off the market. And the other is, I believe the people that are still on the market, that are still listed, are primarily motivated sellers, and either need to sell or really, really want to sell. And because of that, are being a little bit more flexible with their prices. It's not the overly high demand, low inventory market we had a few years ago. I think, to your point, it's balancing out a little bit, and the people still on the market are probably the most motivated to sell. So I don't think that's a long-term trend, but I think it's something that we probably need to get used to for the next few months.
So I guess that kind of, we'll get to that at a later point in this discussion. But I think one of the things on everybody's mind is, how will the unemployment in the segment of people who it hits, how does that relate to our homeowner population? Because it would seem that, at least here in the Bay Area, the segments that, because I was looking at the numbers with the Silicon Valley Index, and it was leisure and hospitality, retail trades, transportation and warehousing, and other services that were most hit by unemployment in this. But that represents somewhere between 500 and 750,000 jobs just in the Bay Area. What are your thoughts on how that segment of people is concentrated amongst our homeownership, either buyers or homeowners, that would cause foreclosures or cause more distress to the market? What are your thoughts?
We actually have a slide on that somewhere.
Okay.
It's the slide with the chart of numbers from the census.
Let me see here.
We have the results of the poll if you're interested in
Sure.
knowing.
Well, slide.
We ended up with a 70-30. So yes, that the offers have been lower than their expectations, and 30% no, so not lower than their expectations.
Got it. So 70% are seeing offers lower than their expectation. So let's. I can't quite figure out how to jump right to that slide. We will get to that. Is that okay if we roll right through this? Rick?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. So looking at the forecast of really, again, answering the three questions: how deep will this go? How long will it last? And how long will it take to recover? As Rick pointed to, we had a nice rise coming out of the December, November, December, January market, primarily because of those ideal conditions of super low interest rates and, for us, super low inventory. It was like the lowest inventory we'd seen on record. In Santa Clara County specifically, we saw over a 10% rise in the median home price just between January and March 13th. But since shelter in place has been coming to play, the median price has pulled back 4% already. But this is looking at, so the narrative, the question is, how will both the stock market decline and this recession potentially hit the Bay Area market? for all of our people who viewers online who are here in the Bay Area. This is looking at the 40-year chart on Bay Area real estate. This is Case-Shiller data for adjusted for home prices at the median or higher. And you'll see every one of these little dips on the chart is a recession that we've experienced of some kind. But to Rick's point, the interesting thing that we are probably, this recession that we're going to face is probably most like 9/11 in the sense that it was an external event that caused everything to shut down for a period of time, and that kind of launched us both from a stock market decline and an economic decline. But so it was a pretty deep down and a quick comeback. Just to give you guys an idea, because our real estate market here in the Bay Area is so highly correlated to our stock market is so highly correlated to real estate, because so many of our buyers, with these home prices being as high as they are, they're cashing in stock to buy these homes, and so they have been tied. But this was which was interesting when we looked at the numbers. This was the drop in the Nasdaq after 9/11. So stock market dropped the Nasdaq 73% from its peak down to the trough in 2011. I'm sorry, 2001 after 9/11. But Bay Area real estate, interestingly enough, was only hit 10%. Bay Area home prices on the average just dropped 10%. And the other thing that we looked at is another scenario more recently where we saw stock market decline, where the economy was still pretty good, was at the end of 2018. Anybody who is in the Bay Area certainly felt this. Our fourth quarter 2018 in the stock market was pretty abysmal. Facebook, Apple, Netflix, and Google all dropped somewhere between 25 and 40%. And it did affect our market, but it only went down by 8%. So again, 73% drop in the NASDAQ, 10% hit to Bay Area real estate prices. That last dip we had in the stock market that was significant in 2018, 25 to 40% drop, only 8%. So the durability of value for our Bay Area real estate market is quite good. The question, though, then is, okay, so prices might come down somewhere between 4% and 10%. I don't think we're going to see a big dip. The question is, how long will it take for things to recover? And Rick and I were contemplating this yesterday. And if you think about it, our real estate market, it kind of, for most of us, it doesn't shut down completely, but it definitely slows down between Thanksgiving and the first weekend of January. Usually, most of our real estate markets, we have closings. I know we've had some really strong Q4s, but most of those things go into contract in September, October, and they close in November and early December. But we typically see the market slow down, right, between the Christmas holidays. And how long then does it take from us to come back from a partial shutdown, in essence, to get back to kind of full momentum? And it's usually somewhere between 75 and 90 days. It's like we were just starting to hit our stride here. So that's how long it will take to come back from a potential slowdown. So maybe 90 days. And then we try to also look at kind of what's the worst case scenario of how long it might take to come back. And one case in point that we can point to is looking at, this is a graph from Zillow. Zillow did some research on, they were looking at what real estate markets around the world have had an epidemic where their real estate market was hit. And that was, we all remember hearing about SARS in 2003. It didn't hit the US very much, but it did significantly impact Hong Kong specifically. And this is what happened with their real estate market. The dark blue line you see is their real estate transactions, their average annual real estate transactions. And the yellow line is that SARS event. And it took them about 6 months for their market to regain full velocity after that. So as far as, how deep will it go? We will see, but how long it will last, hopefully by the time the shelter in place is lifted, we'll be back and running within 3 to 6 months. Rick, what are your additional thoughts on that?
Well, one thing to point out about this, and I'm sure everybody can see this looking at it, there was something else going on with Hong Kong real estate at this point, because if you look at the blue line, prices were plummeting before SARS hit, and continued to plummet. And at some point, I think they got to a point where buyers almost couldn't help themselves but come back to the market. So I think part of this is normal recovery, and part of this is value based. We could be looking at something like this. One of the great unknowns with the current situation is, and I know that I was going back and forth with somebody on LinkedIn earlier today, Neil Kashkari, who ran for governor in California a couple of years ago, pointed out that we could be looking at waves rather than a V-shaped recovery, because we're not sure if we're going to have another series of infections after the shelter-in-place orders are lifted, how soon vaccines or medical treatments might be available to prevent or handle this outbreak. So, I mean, he's saying we could be looking start to finish at an 18-month cycle where it gradually gets better and back to normal, but not all at once. I think, if you look at best case scenario, we go through this first shutdown, figure out how to mitigate the spread of the virus going forward, and we could be out of this in between 3 and 6 months. But it is going to take some time. I expect April home sales numbers to be awful nationally. I don't expect May numbers to be much better, because May sales would entail people out looking and making contracts in April. I don't expect that to be happening too much. So I really don't think we start to get back to a semblance of normal until June at the earliest. And again, it's not something to panic about. It's just what it is. What it is. I do think, assuming we get this thing under control, that we could see some seasonal abnormalities. We could see property sales go up in September instead of down like they usually do, and we could see a busier fourth quarter than we're used to. But
that would be fantastic. That would be great. Let me ask this question. So, what obviously the pace. Let's say right here in California, we were supposed to be sheltering in place till May 3rd. Gavin Newsom now saying we're probably adjusting that timeline. Obviously, it's fluid, day by day it changes, but they're saying May 13th. So assuming they say they shoot the starting gun, bang, what we know from what we hear so far from the media is that it's not going to be a full wide open, right? Right now, from the stats we can see is 59% of buyers and sellers have kind of left the playing field. We're going to say, okay, guys, game's back on. You can come back on the field. Two questions. What do we think might happen as those buyers and sellers and people kind of go back to work and resume things? That's question number one. Like what that might be like, what factors might speed that up or slow it down. And then secondly, how much do we think the impact of the unemployment for, here in the Bay Area, up to 27% of workers were deemed non-essential that have had some unemployment claims. How might that impact it going forward? And I'm going to go to your next slide here, Rick.
There we go. This is an eye test for everybody on the call today. So about 60% of jobs nationally, and you mentioned percentages in I guess 27% in your area specifically, are people whose jobs are in the most heavily impacted types of businesses: retail, restaurants, transportation, hospitality, leisure activities, and candidly, most of those are not high-paying jobs. So one of the things to keep in mind is that home ownership rates vary significantly based on income. And what all this chart really talks about, and this is from the Census Bureau, is home ownership rates for households above the median rate and for households below the median. And historically, consistently, we've been at almost 80% home ownership rates for families who have income that's equal to or higher than median family incomes in their area. And that home ownership rate drops all the way down to about 50% for families whose income is less. So my suspicion is, at least in the early stages of the pandemic, the people that are going to be hit the hardest are actually renters rather than home owners, just based on the math. I do think what you'll see is a little bit, if that's correct, I think what we'll see is a little bit of a slowdown in demand coming out of the pandemic, because those renters who might have been just about getting ready to buy a house will probably need a little bit of time to get their financial house back in order. Whether they've been, haven't had income for a few months, maybe have missed some rent payments. Similarly, homeowners who are in forbearance programs during the pandemic might have a little bit harder of a time qualifying for their next loan if they were ready to sell their house and move up. So we could have a little bit of a slowdown there. That will be offset, in my mind anyway, by the fact that household formation has been increasing pretty dramatically, over 1 million new households a year for the last couple of years. And builders have not been building nearly enough inventory to accommodate that growth. And particularly in California, and especially in some of the Northern California markets, as well as places like Orange County and LA, we've had such low inventory available for sale that even if demand is a little bit weaker than it had been, we should start to see a little bit more equilibrium. But I don't think we're going to get to a point where it becomes a buyer's market all of a sudden.
Got it. So that seems to make that seems to make sense. So if what you're saying is that the highest concentration of the non-essential jobs, say in retail, restaurants, and those types of things, those home buyers are going to be more for the entry level quartile or the first rung on the real estate homeownership ladder. We might see a little lessening in demand there, but it'll be offset by the fact that we just still have such low supply.
Yep. And again, as the millennial generation gets older, gets their real jobs, if you will, gets married, starts to have kids, all of those things move them toward home ownership. So there will be some continued demand. Where I think there will be some weakness is in the move-up buyer whose income was hit during this crisis, who will have to spend some time getting their finances back in order.
And that's kind of what I think too is, okay, if they say bang, the gun goes off and everybody resumes play, that the fact that there is, even if you still have a job, there might be a little bit of either job insecurity or wage insecurity that causes some of those people to, well, let's put our plans on pause right now and let's just kind of see how things unfold. And I think that's probably...
I think credit's going to tighten up too, Brett. If you're applying for a loan and the lender sees that you asked for forbearance and were out of work for 3 or 4 months, that makes you a riskier borrower because they don't know how stable your job's going to be going forward. So I do think there's a segment of the population that's going to be definitely affected by this, and it will hit demand a little bit, but not to the point, I think, where we have an oversupply issue by any means.
Now, Rick, one of the things that you wanted to talk a little bit about this is, I think, from Mike Delpreet, a little snapshot into what's happened in China. And
yeah, it's from Mike Delpreet. For Mike Delpreet, courtesy of the same Zillow report that you referenced earlier. So we're all using the same slides. And Mike and I differ a little bit on this one. Mike used this chart to show the bottom line, the blue line. So
this is property sales in China for the last 4 years, it looks like, right?
And the current numbers are the blue line at the very bottom. Mike shows this as a way of saying, look how far they have to go to recover. And my take, maybe I'm a glass half full kind of guy, but my take is I can't believe they're recovering this quickly. So every year in China, around the time of the Lunar New Year, transactions basically come to a halt. And then usually they jump right back up after that. This year, what we saw was that the pandemic hit about the same time as the Lunar New Year, and things really just stopped for several weeks. Imagine if the U.S. housing market in terms of sales stopped for a few weeks. You were talking earlier about how long it takes to restart the engine and gear things back up. What I'm seeing is actually a pretty encouraging trend considering how long the Chinese market was shut down and considering really how strict the quarantine was in China, how many jobs were eliminated temporarily. So I look at this really as an indicator that within 6 weeks, that market was actually kind of up and running again. And I suspect if we look at this a couple of weeks from now, we'll start to see that trend continue to move upward at a rapid pace.
Yeah, it looks like, just what I'm seeing looking at this graph it looks like in a regular year without coronavirus, it's interesting that you said their epidemic of coronavirus really broke out on at their New Year holiday.
Yep.
It usually takes 3 to 4 weeks for their market to go from ground zero to gain momentum. And it looks like it's regaining its momentum about half the speed. So if, again, this is just conjecture, guys. So we're making our best guesses. If in the U.S. it takes us 3 months to get up to full speed with our real estate market, from a half start when things slow down coming out of Christmas and New Year's, if that also applies, it kind of points to what we're saying. Worst case scenario, it might take us 6 months to get back up to full momentum. But one thing I do want to point out is not to be pessimistic, but I think to plan, to be realistic, we have to understand that the reason we pointed out the number of transactions at the beginning of this call was for those of us in real estate that are planning our income and our businesses around that. Well, guess what? If 59% of the listings have not come to market, that's 59% fewer paychecks that are floating around. And obviously most everyone here at Side and the partners affiliated with this company, we're all garnering our unfair share of those checks in the marketplace, because most of these people are top producers. It's going to be less. So we'll talk more about that as we talk about a prescriptive formula to get ahead during this opportunity. But let's talk about the lending and foreclosure impact. How will the unemployment rate drive foreclosures, and how will mortgage rates likely play out of this? You want to share a little more here, Rick?
Yeah, in order to look forward, we have to look back a little bit and see where we were when the pandemic hit. And the good news is, because of the loan quality we talked about before, because of the record level of home equity, we were actually looking at near record lows in terms of delinquencies and foreclosures. So to put this in perspective for you, historically, about 1% of loans are in foreclosure at any point in time, and about 4% of loans are delinquent but not in foreclosure. Immediately prior to this pandemic, we were looking at less than 4%, about 3.5 to 3.7% of loans being delinquent, and about 0.5% of loans being in foreclosure. So again, moving into this trying time, the market from a foreclosure standpoint has really never been healthier.
Got it.
And jump to the next slide.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Sure.
My deck is freezing up there. Okay, did I go back too far? Shoot. Sorry about that, Rick. I was hitting the advance button here, and everything was in a little slow motion. So
the fun of whoops.
Yeah,
this is live TV.
Okay, here we go. So,
and this is also a little bit of encouraging news, and it doesn't look like it at first blush, but the forbearance programs that have been implemented. So
and just for the benefit of any of the real estate professionals who didn't survive through the last crisis and crash, to set the context of what is a forbearance versus a foreclosure. We know foreclosure, if you don't pay, eventually the bank's going to file a notice and then come sell your property at the courthouse steps through a deed of trust. But what's the forbearance there, Rick?
So in this case, and it's not the technical term that the mortgage industry uses, but a forbearance means we're going to defer payments. So we will work with you, and the government's CARES Act put in place a forbearance program for any government-backed loan. So that's any loan that's owned by Fannie Mae, by Freddie Mac, or is insured by the FHA, the VA, or the USDA. A borrower only needs to reach out to their mortgage servicer and claim that their income has been affected by the COVID-19 virus, and they will qualify for up to 180 days of forbearance, which means they don't have to make their house payment for the next 6 months. At the end of that period, they can also then request an additional 180 days. So theoretically, for about 62% of the mortgages that are out there, this government program could defer payments for up to a year. The borrowers do have to pay that back. They are not supposed to have their credit dinged, although, as we talked about earlier, the fact that they're applying for these is going to make lenders look at them a little bit sideways going forward. But their credit won't be dinged. There won't be any extra interest payments. And they'll have one of three ways to pay these back. They'll either be asked to make a balloon payment at the end of the forbearance period, which would be a disaster, because if you've been out of work for 6 months, you certainly aren't going to have 6 months worth of mortgage payments to make. They can be tacked on to the end of the loan, which is probably what's going to happen for the most part. So if you miss 6 months of payments, didn't make those payments for 6 months, you have 6 additional months at the end. Or they can be re-amortized over the length of your loan in a loan modification. So they'll take the 6 months payments that were deferred, they'll mix them into what you still owe, and then amortize it over however much time you have left in your loan.
So that's a good option, though, for example, if someone has a client that either got laid off or furloughed and they're seeing a drop in their income, if you have them coming to you as a real estate professional saying, hey, maybe we're considering selling, you do want to check with them and ask them, obviously, have you considered a forbearance?
Yeah, and their mortgage servicers should be able to tell them if theirs is a government-backed loan. There are also links on the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac site that let you look up your loan to see if they own it. So there are resources you can provide to your clients to help them through this. And yeah, Brett, it's a great point. If somebody's thinking about selling because their income has been hit, they should take full advantage of these programs to make sure that they avail themselves of government help. Also important to note that most of the private lenders, most of the banks are offering similar programs, not quite as generous, but similar for people who don't have government-backed loans. Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Citibank, JP Morgan Chase all announced forbearance programs, I think minimum of 90 days of forbearance. Mm-hmm. And it's important to tell your clients that the rules in terms of repayment are all negotiable, and they should kind of stick to their guns and try and negotiate for what's best for them in those kind of environments. Also, if you're working with any clients that are investors, the government program also covers investment properties. So if you have somebody who's renting out several properties with a Freddie or Fannie backed loan, they also qualify for forbearance. The quid pro quo here is that they're expected to pass along that forbearance to their renters and not charge them while they're deferring their own payments. The expectation had been that we would have a huge number of people apply for these forbearances.
Yes.
And the good news is that according to the Mortgage Bankers Association, only about 2.66% of mortgage holders applied for these forbearances by the end of last week. Numbers up a little bit over 3% as of today, but the fear had been that these numbers would have gotten up as high as 25%, which would have essentially bankrupted the mortgage servicing industry and caused a lot of chaos in the channel.
Interesting. So it's another data point that points to the fact that the financial stability of homeowners is much greater than that of renters, because these people who get furloughed, many of the people who don't own homes, obviously the ones that are two paychecks away from not having anything in the bank.
You mentioned that earlier, Brett, and at the same time period that we looked at the mortgage forbearance requests, we saw a similar report out on rental payments. And normally about 81% of rent payments are made on time. This past month, the number was down to 69%. So it was a 12% swing, which again was about 5 or 6 times higher than the difference in homeowners making their payments or requesting a deferment.
And that single event, just to speak to it, that single event of a renter not paying their rent could be, something that precipitates, right, the landlord to sell that property. For example, I was just making some follow-up calls this morning. I had a past client reach out to me and he said, hey, my folks, I moved from California to Florida. They're going to want to be coming soon. And they just had one of their renters stop paying them, and they started an eviction process before the coronavirus broke out. But now they can't complete that eviction process because of everything that's happening here. And he said, the fact that they're not getting rent, he's like, I'm throwing my hands in the air. I want to sell this property. So for those of you that are, we'll talk about pockets of opportunity coming out of this, but let's move on. We were talking about how will unemployment rates drive foreclosures, and it doesn't sound like it's going to make a significant impact. Is that true?
Hope springs eternal. Historically, there's 2 things that you can count on with unemployment rates. I have found there's an inflection point between 5 and 6% unemployment, where depending on which way employment is going, you see a significant change in sales transactions. So if you're going from below 5% to above 5%, you see sales transactions dip. And if you're going from above 6% to below 6%, you start to see sales transactions pick up. Similarly, when you see unemployment rates go up, you typically see foreclosures go up. The last cycle, which is the one that's represented by that huge mountainous looking chart in the middle, is really sort of an aberration. We actually had unemployment caused by the housing market meltdown, which drove the foreclosures through the stratosphere. I mentioned earlier that in a normal market, you have 1% foreclosures and 4% delinquencies. At the peak of the last market, we had about 12% delinquency and about 4% foreclosures. So the numbers were just off the charts. All of the people that filed for unemployment so far, the 3 million and then 6 and 6 million after that, represent about 10% of the workforce. The real question here is how long they remain unemployed. And that's what will ultimately drive the foreclosure rate. It's hard to predict right now because in prior situations, the job losses were permanent. So it was sort of inevitable that at some point the borrower would stop making payments and the foreclosure process would begin. There's usually a 3 to 6 month lag time there. In this case, it could be a year's lag time before we know if that borrower is even going to be able to start making payments again. At that point, you would hope within a year somebody be able to find a new job, assuming the economy's back in some sort of semblance of normalcy. And we may not see the kind of lift in foreclosures that you would expect with the kind of unemployment numbers we're going to see because most of them hopefully will be temporary. But we will see some lift. It's just a little bit too early to predict how much. And we won't see any of those properties really start coming to market for well over a year, even if they do wind up going into foreclosure.
Got it. So, well, opportunities and bright spots. So this was just some of the comments we made just talking about this last slide. We are talking about that. I think, we opened this conversation by saying, although the world may be in crisis, your business doesn't have to be. And as a little bit of a student of the Asian culture, I practice meditation and other things that I thought were pretty cool. One of the interesting things about the Asian culture is the character that they use, the kanji, the two characters that come together to represent the word crisis is one is danger and the other is opportunity. And so on the one side here where we see danger, slow inventory, that's somewhat of a threat to us, stock market's down, economic uncertainty, and the fact that we will all need to work harder. It's tempered by, on the other side, this opportunity. Many agents were sidelined. So when I got into the business, Rick, in 2008, I felt fortunate in one hand because as I developed my natural rhythms and productivity rhythms and work ethic, I didn't know what I didn't know. So I just did the work that was required to make a deal happen. And the agents around me at the time were kind of like, wow, this is so difficult. It's so challenging. But I didn't know any different. And so that's one of the things that if you allow yourself to do a mental reset as you go into a market shift, and we'll talk about the mindset around a market shift, and is that it presents a huge opportunity. 41% of the agents between 2008 and 2011 left the real estate business. So those that stuck around gained market share. I don't know if you guys had heard, anyone had heard, but there was something that came across Inman on the Newswire earlier this week, or actually it was last week, that Redfin had furloughed 41%. It was interesting that it was exactly that same number. 41% of Redfin agents had been furloughed given this market shift. So there's an opportunity there. Obviously, interest rates are still low, as Rick pointed to. Motivated sellers will represent an opportunity for some of our buyers who had a hard time getting into the market, and this you can gain market share. I want to dive into a really kind of a prescriptive model of 5 things that you can do to thrive through a shifting market. And as I mentioned, I got in the business in 2008 myself, and I was able to double my business every year. I started a real estate team in 2011. We got to become, by 2013, one of the top teams in the USA on the Wall Street Journal list. And I know that wouldn't have been possible without the conditions around a market shift. And so I want to kind of walk through briefly, because we know, here's what we know. The number of paychecks has decreased. 59% of people are off the field. Prices have come down a little bit, probably will come down just a little bit more, maybe somewhere between 4% and 8%. And it might take us 3 to 6 months to gain full momentum from the time we let people back on the playing field, so to speak, and shelter in place is lifted. So this is what are things that you're going to want to think about. Number one is you're going to want to get your finances in order. And what I mean by that is know your real expenses. If you haven't done a P&L for your business, do one. Do one for your life as well. Know exactly what your monthly nut is. And so if you do, for whatever reason, need to take advantage of something like a forbearance, like Rick mentioned, you'll know where you stand and if you need to pull that lever. And you might think twice about it. As Rick mentioned, it could impact your credit ability if you either want to buy up in the near future or invest. Do take that in consideration. I personally would recommend or opt more for a home equity line of credit that would give you that liquidity, and because there certainly will be opportunities. Second thing is know the ROI on your marketing. We'll talk about exactly how to do that. And number 3 is obviously have a budget, as I mentioned. Number 4, set a goal for 3 months of core capital. So 3 months of core capital means the amount, 3 months of full operating expenses. If you pay yourself a salary in your real estate business, have that set aside, as well as 3 months of operating expenses. As you begin to grow your business, this is what really helped me make decisions where I wasn't feeling anxious or uncertain about, could I afford this? Because sometimes when you're testing new marketing initiatives and things, and there'll be plenty of opportunities to test marketing initiatives on the backside of this, and we'll talk about what some of those are. You want to know you have the money to ride it out while you're doing that. And then number 5, what unnecessary expenses can you cut? I'll share a quick concept that our founder from Side shared with me, Guy Gal, as they were making the tough decisions to carry this company forward as well through this time. They did an exercise called muscle, bone, and fat. So as you look at your expenses in your business, look at those things and find, as you go through your credit card statement, you might even use 3 different colors of highlighters. Highlight ones that are bone, like absolutely I need this no matter what. For example, your MLS dues. Then what things are muscle, meaning they're there and you don't need them to survive, but they do help you make forward movement in your business. And that might be something, some paid marketing that you're doing, for example, Zillow or otherwise. And then the third thing would be fat. And that would be things that, things that you've tested that maybe haven't proven themselves out yet. I know we've done a lot of pay-per-click marketing that has been relatively successful in the past, but when we looked at the ROI on it this last time around, it didn't make the cut. So you're going to want to do that. When you want to figure out what is working, and you're going to want to focus or double down. So the second formula in the 5 prescriptive parts of, or the prescription for the shift, is double down on your lead generation. So you're going to want to focus on those things that are working. So list every single closing that you've had in the last 24 months. Take a look at the sales prices and the source of each. Determine the cost of each source, and then you're going to want to double down on your best 2 or 3. When we last did this, we probably have 10 different places where business comes from outside of referral, open house, Zillow. We've got a few different referral networks, some direct mail campaigns. We really drilled down into what was our highest ROI and best producing, and for us it was sphere of influence, obviously. Zillow, when we compared that to all of our other online efforts, was a winner for us, as well as open houses and farm. Now, obviously, open houses are not easy to do right now, but you're going to want to double down on those things that are your core things. The other thing that you're going to want to do is double down or identify personally in your database, who are your people who are the most motivated buyers or sellers. This is a great text message. We've sent this out to the people in our CRM that had been visiting and viewing properties. I know we sent out 200 texts last night. We got 38 responses back and a number of virtual showing appointments set like right away. And it's just a simple text. Hey, hey John, or hey, first name. I wanted to check in and see if you'd like me to visit a few homes and live stream them to you without having to leave the comfort of your home. Of course, I'll practice social distancing and COVID guidelines in the process. Let me know. So just a simple text message like that to your people who've actively been viewing properties in the last 30 days on your website allows those people who are your most motivated to raise their hands and self-select. And we'll talk about what you're going to do next with those people who don't, which is probably going to be the majority of people who are on the sidelines. But we want to first segment our database and figure out, who are the ones that are going to want to transact. If you want to screenshot this on your phone or however you're watching this, do that now, because I'm going to switch to the next slide. And maybe Leanne, if you could put that text in the chat box for people to copy if they want to. Second thing you're going to want to do is double down on the most motivated buyers and sellers. We talk about the 4 Ds that typically are people, because what we know is coming out of this, we said people are going to have some wage insecurity, some job insecurity, and just general uncertainty about the market. So those people that are committed to sell are going to be the most motivated. Typically, notice of defaults is something that you could farm. When I did that, I grew my business from 2008 to 2011. I sent out 2,000 pieces of mail every month to the notice of defaults, and consistently would get 3 or 4 listings out of that. Other thing that will be coming up, we got a lot of people sheltering in place, husbands and wives spending a lot of time together, and we're either going to have a baby boom on the other side of this, or they're going to have a divorce boom. But it's going to take it one way or the other for people. So we will probably see divorce filings increase. So if you have divorce attorneys in your network, be sure to reach out to them. Downsize. The people, the silver tsunami, as we call it here in Silicon Valley. So many people, Mercury News did an article about a month ago, surveyed Bay Area homeowners, and close to 40% said they had plans on leaving the Bay Area within 5 years. You got to know that some of those people, with the shelter in place and just the heightened level of fear and proximity of being in crowded spaces, is going to drive or precipitate a move sooner possibly for some of those people. So that would be another target audience. And then obviously death, inheritance, and probate. So those are some opportunities. The other one that I didn't list here would be investment property owners. Given the moratorium on evictions, we're going to see some people take advantage of that. And if you've owned a rental property for 10 or 15 years, you've been getting checks like clockwork, and now your tenant's not paying and you can't get them out. That also might precipitate some of these people to consider offers. So those would be the areas, the pockets of opportunity. Anything that you want to add to that, Rick?
Yeah, just I want to emphasize what you just said about the landlords. There are going to be some who find themselves over leveraged at this time, and really will need to sell their properties. So I think the timing is good there for investors who are looking for long-term rental opportunities. I also think in the near term, we're actually going to see an increase in renters because I think a lot of people that were almost ready to buy a house are not going to be able to do so because of finances. And so I think we're going to wind up needing more rental units than we have today. So that's one area. The other, of course, will be on defaults. But again, I think while there will be an uptick, I don't think we're going to see a lot of inventory hit the market for quite some time.
Cool. We're going to move right on, and then we'll take some Q&A. Going back, I'm having some of the same challenges that you did here with the slides. So double down on the most motivated buyers and sellers, as we talked about. Triple your efforts on lead conversion. So we talked about tighten up your expenses, focus on those people that are the most motivated, and double down on your lead generation. Triple your efforts on lead conversion. What I mean here is, what we know is because fewer people are transacting, one, we're going to have to talk to more people. But in addition, we're going to have to talk to them more frequently. Because in a shifting market, what happens is fear comes up. And so we're going to have a little bit of hesitation and pause on behalf of our buyers and sellers. So we're going to need to talk to them and communicate with them more frequently and with more clarity and conviction. So you're going to want to really focus on time blocking your prospecting and follow-up to make sure that you're in front of those people. As I looked for a slide to put this together, I was like looking for, a guy on the phone, and most of them had people with very serious faces, and I saw this guy with a smile on his face, and that really is the name of the game. If you're really coming from a place of caring and connecting with people, which, by the way, while we're sheltering in place, the advice that I've given to my team, let's find out who of those people are the most motivated. We'll communicate to them and do some selling activities with them, obviously, to help them move down the pipeline. But for everyone else, which is probably 90% of your database, your messaging shouldn't be anything about selling. It's purely about caring, connecting, contribution, and providing clarity. So that's kind of our focus. We've taken that scripting, and really it's simply the call. It's, hey, Rick, I just wanted to check in, and how are you? How is your family and you holding up? We obviously let that conversation unfold, and we've chosen to partner with a local nonprofit that's delivering free groceries. So we're asking all of our clients if either they can't get out, or they know anyone who can't get out or shouldn't get out, or has hit hard times with either furlough or layoffs, and we're providing free groceries for those people. And I tell you, it generates a ton of goodwill, gives you the visibility to stay in front of your base of people. The other thing that we're going to need to do in a shifting market, and obviously you being on the Zoom is one of these things right now, is you're going to need to increase your training efforts. I can tell you, I don't think I've attended more Zooms, trainings and webinars in the last 30 days than I have in the last 2 years. And I'm an education-based guy. So, but get used to it until we've really mastered all the nuances of what this market and the opportunities and challenges it presents to us. Second thing you're going to want to do is become a master of market trends and stats. Some of the slides that I shared here early in the deck about the why real estate's the best place to be, how the durability, we look at the stock market drop, but Bay Area real estate only dropped just a fraction. Feel free to reach out to me at after this presentation. I could share that deck with you, and I think Liani will be willing to share our slides here as well. But become a master of market trends and stats. A great subscription service, if you want to add that for your buyers and sellers, is something called Keeping Current Matters. Keeping Current Matters. They have some fantastic slides they put out on a weekly basis about what's happening with the market on a national level. Third is master virtual presentations for both buyers and sellers. And then lastly, we have to not only understand this data, but be able to articulate it well to move our buyers and sellers, because they're going to have some hesitation and reservation. We're going to nurture or nudge these people along to help them in the pursuit of their goals, to help them move past fear. So that's that's the fourth one. And the last one is be very visible and over communicate. With buyers, it's really going to be educating them on the market. It's two things: educating them on the market, and the second thing is digging deeper into what is their why, like what's their life reason that they need to purchase this home or sell this home now. Because you can't do it just on data alone. People buy on logic, and then they buy on emotion, and then they justify with logic and reason. But logic and data creates thinking, emotion creates action. So you really want to probe and understand why people are making the moves that they are. The other thing, the second part of this is just educate. And so post positive news and trends about the market to make yourself a credible voice through all this noise that they're experiencing. Want to dive into the Q&A here. We have some live Q&A. One from John Woodruff: how does Rick feel the election will affect the market? My assumption is in a normal market, sales would stall out a few weeks before, but what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, historically, that's exactly what happens. I don't know that that's going to be the case. And usually it's because of uncertainty over who's going to win the election and what the implications might be for the market. I think if we're into a recovery at that point, market momentum will probably overcome that kind of typical uncertainty. So I don't think November is going to set new sales records, But it'll probably be a little busier than usual. So I don't know that the election this year will have the same kind of effect on slowing things down as we're used to. But there's always a degree of uncertainty that will keep some people off the market. Yeah, really good question with no specific answer that we can give you.
Yeah. Another question came up from another participant here is what are the things like, what should I be saying to my buyers or sellers about the market? And one of the things we shared earlier in the presentation, I think is, the effect that shelter in place, because it's not coronavirus, right? That's affected the market. Specifically, it's the shelter in place that's taken everyone off the playing field and out of their jobs. So shelter in place was designed to flatten the curve. And so I like using the metaphor for buyers and sellers is, well, really what this has done is it's flattened the curve for real estate. We, in Silicon Valley in the Bay Area, we saw an accelerated appreciation in the months of January and February, so much the median home price jumped almost 10%, and this really put a damper on it. In fact, it's kind of a much needed damper because the last time we saw this kind of rapid price appreciation, at least in the South Bay, in Silicon Valley, was right after Google announced they were building another campus. We saw prices run up 25% in 6 months, and then the market pulled back, and it was this really uncomfortable for both buyers and sellers market that was kind of a little bit herky-jerky for a while. So in some senses, the flattening of the curve that's caused the coronavirus to not wreak havoc, I could say that this is flattening the curve for real estate and may temper some of the factors that were going to cause maybe some problems with the real estate market. So I think that's a positive way to look at it. The other thing I would tell your buyers and sellers is it really depends. Are you a buyer or are you a seller? And if you are, let's take a look at the data and your goals and determine that opportunity. While we're sheltering in place, one of the things my team and I have been doing to help both build pipeline with these conversations with buyers and sellers and use this technology like Zoom is when we're doing our calling and prospecting and we run into somebody who, obviously has put their plans on hold. The two questions we ask are, one, what were your plans before all this happened? Or what were you hoping to do after all of this is over? And our offer to them is, let's do this. We're doing these 15-minute Zoom market updates. I'm happy to spend 15 minutes with you and or your spouse. We can go online. We can review some of the market trends and stats together, talk about your goals, and see how that might affect your long-term plans. Right? So just the thing that we want to do as professionals is be this voice of calm and clarity throughout amidst all the noise. So that's what I would say there. Let's see. This is more of a comment than
we have a question, an early question, Brett, about interest rates. For what it's worth, and predicting rates is always a dangerous way to live.
I made some predictions about the market that may put egg on my face later. We'll see.
But my personal belief is that interest rates will actually go down on conventional loans between now and the end of the year. If you want to actually take a look at historical trends, you look at the yields on U.S. Treasuries and you look at the 30-year fixed interest rate on mortgages, and they run completely in parallel. Right now, we're at historically low yields on U.S. Treasuries because there's been a flight to safety. And ironically, the more people that invest in Treasuries, the lower their returns because the more they're paying for the bonds in the first place. We should actually have lower interest rates than we do today based on the returns on those treasuries. We don't because of all the uncertainty in the market as it comes to mortgage servicing, as it comes to warehouse lines, what the Fed's doing, how much they're buying in terms of mortgage securities. So again, my suspicion is once the dust settles, we're going to wind up actually seeing rates go down at least this year and be somewhere in the mid to low 3% range. Again, once the dust settles. So I think interest rates will be one of the things that helps make sure the market comes back in a reasonable period of time. The last thing anybody in charge wants to do is to jack up interest rates at a time when the housing market's trying to get restarted. That would be a catastrophe.
Someone else asked the question, how do we find out how much equity are there in homes in a specific area? The program I use is called Property Radar, propertyradar.com.
It's a great resource.
It's a pretty great resource for carving up data and pulling lists of different types of property owners. This is more of a comment than a question. I personally think that shelter in place has actually helped in many areas, folks working from home. For example, being more productive, cleaner air, ease of conference calls via Zoom. I can't help but think this will make home ownership even more desirable. Do we agree in our thoughts? Certainly, people are spending more time in their home than they ever have, like in the history of home ownership, I'm certain. And I think that will precipitate, again, some people who just realize, this home really works for me and I love it, but maybe I'm going to add on to it, or this home doesn't work for me. I really need a space. What are your thoughts on that, Rick?
I think we're going to see some fundamental shifts in the commercial real estate market. So for any of you that are dealing with commercial, I think the office environment is going to change, maybe not immediately, but pretty significantly because of this. It's ironic that huge technology companies in the Bay Area and Silicon Valley were among the last people to allow telecommuting. And only did it because of the pandemic. But
all the Zoom employees were required to work at the office.
That's the funny part. That's great. So I do think there will be more telecommuting. I think there will be more working from home. I think that'll have an implication for the office market. I also think, to the questioner's point, it could make home ownership more desirable, and where those homes are could shift pretty significantly too. You don't necessarily have to be living close to the office in order to be able to telecommute. So I think there will be some fundamental changes. But for those of you working in the commercial market, I'm looking at winners and losers right now. I think the retail market is going to be hurting pretty significantly when this is over. There were a lot of retailers who were on the precipice of failure before any of this, and going, revenue free for a few months is not going to help their position. And
consumer behavior patterns, right? Where, if there might have been a certain cohort that was a little resistant to shopping online, that's now shopping online and comfortable with that. Or, for example, I've got a number of agents and partners that we've known that Zoom meetings would be a very effective way to connect with clients. Like we always do them for people who are coming in from out of town. Yep. And we secure that relationship, and it eliminates all the friction of having to get together physically. But now they're having to do this all the time. We'll recognize, well, this is something that we're going to carry over. So I think the trend of online buying and doing things online and doing things virtually is just going to push to the next level. But I do want to be mindful of time. We ran about 15 minutes over here, and so we want to wrap it up. But Rick, any final things that you want to say in closing?
Well, Shelley just sent an interesting question, which I'll answer briefly. It's what do I think good usage of shopping centers should be? Successful investors in real estate properties over the last few years have been turning traditional retail centers into multi-use facilities. So a combination of entertainment, eateries, shopping, in some cases, even residencies. And my running joke is that for baby boomers who grew up living in the mall, their parents always said, why don't you just move there? You live there anyway. You might actually come full circle, and they actually will be living there. So I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities in certain areas for student housing and for senior housing in what used to be shopping centers, just because of their location. So I think it's all about creativity. But right now, I want to emphasize one of the things that Brett said earlier in his tips. In every industry I've ever been in, and like Brett, I'm not a lifer in real estate and mortgage. I spent the first 20 years of my career doing marketing for technology companies. In every industry I've ever participated in, the companies and the individuals who marketed through a recession were always ones who managed to increase market share during the recovery. I'm eating my own dog food here, in that I'm doing more presentations on Zoom. I'm more active on social media. I'm spending more time reconnecting with my network than I did prior to the pandemic. And I think if you do the same thing, if you're willing to put in the time, work on yourself, but also work on keeping your profile active, you're going to be one of the survivors coming out of this mess.